Hi, welcome back. We've been making too many complaining videos lately, so let's switch the gears in this one. Since the game is getting harder, quote unquote, through power creep and HP inflation, as we've been discussing for so long now, I think I want to talk about horizontal and vertical investments, two ways to invest in Honkai Star Rail, and each with their own merits and demerits. Which one is more guaranteed to beat all content, and which one is more suited for your playstyle? Let's talk about all of that in today's video. Side note though, when talking about investment, you shouldn't confuse that with actually spending money on this game. This company does not respect you or your wallet and just wants to drain as much out of you. So keep your wallets closed. Before we start, you should like, comment, and subscribe because only a very small percentage of you are actually subscribed. You should also join the Express Discord server for a fun and lovely community to hang out with, where you can chat about anything your heart desires. Now let's get on to it. First off, I want to talk about whether or not Eidolons are even worth getting, because it ties into this topic very heavily. It definitely depends on the character very heavily too. For example, getting E1 Robin is at least 1,000 times more worth it than getting E6 Blade, not only because of the cost, but because E6 Blade still suffers from almost everything E0 Blade does, especially the low damage output. Support Eidolons will almost always be more worth it than main DPS Eidolons, because you can use more support units for multiple DPS units, like E1 Robin being insane for almost every single DPS unit in the game except for break units, and E1 Jiacho applying insane vulnerability whether or not you're using Acheron. Overall though, I believe that most of the time, Eidolons are not going to be as worth as getting a new unit, especially for people looking to invest horizontally. Getting a new unit would give you access to a whole lot more than an Eidolon, and would definitely open up your team comps and would make your account stronger. E1 Robin is definitely one of the top choices if you're going for any Eidolon. Other than that, I wouldn't really get Eidolons unless it's for one of my really favorite characters. I've made a couple videos about the strongest Eidolons in the game before, so if you want any info about that, go check those out. So let's start by defining each of these terms. Vertical investment is when you heavily invest into just one or two teams, sometimes just one character even, getting their Eidolons and signature Lycone as well as their best support. An example of someone who has vertically invested is someone who has only an E2S1 Acheron team with Robin, Jiaocho, and Aventurine, and maybe another team, but that team would most likely be pretty low invested into, maybe something like DOT if they're an old player, or some sort of super break team. Obviously, the biggest limitation vertical investment has is that you're hyper-focusing on only one or two teams, and if you're F2P, then most likely you're not going to have enough Jades to get both, as in the example an E2 S1 Acheron with her best supports, as well as another team that is pretty well invested and can clear content very effectively. Also, without something like E1 Robin for the main team, you're going to be very limited by elemental types, even if someone like Acheron can ignore toughness and 20% resistance. For E2 though, it's not really going to be too bad, honestly. Horizontal investment is when you invest into multiple teams equally, sometimes more than just two and more like 3 or 4 or 5. An example of that would be something like my own accounts. I have Acheron, DOT, Jingliu, Linksha, Hugh, Herda, basically all characters that I really enjoy playing with and that I really like, and they're all moderately invested into. The highest Eidolon I have is both E1 S1 Ranmei and E1 S1 Fugue, because they're some of my favorites. I can clear all content in the game currently, but since I'm missing Feixia, Boothill, or Yun Li, a boss like Hulei is pretty damn difficult for me. Single target is by far my biggest weakness, but an E2S1 Acheron team with E1 Robin, as in the vertically invested example, would be able to beat Hulei pretty easily, honestly. To decide which type of investment is better, we have to look at two main things: your own playstyle as well as what your plans are for the long term. If you're a type of player that gets bored very quickly, like many different characters, and want to experience as many different playstyles as possible, then horizontal investment is definitely for you. It's definitely the more fun option because the more teams you have, the more things you get to try out. Meanwhile, if you just had one or two heavily invested teams, the only teams you would be playing are just those two teams. The key to efficient horizontal investment is to get 2 limited sustains, or if you're fine with Gallagher, then just 1 limited sustain. Get at least 2 limited harmony supports, for example Robin and Ranmei, and then at that point you can almost pull for any DPS you want, provided that they don't need very specific supports like Jingyuan needing Sunday, or Argenti or Blade needing Tribi, who's coming out in 3.1. I believe if you can just get these 2 requirements, you can truly get whatever DPS you want, maybe get a few extra supports here and there like Jade or Topaz, to try to maximize a couple teams like Big Herda or Fei Xiao. If you can do that, pulling your favorite characters as well as clearing the endgame content would be pretty easy. Now, there are definitely some archetypes a lot weaker than others, as we all know. For example, someone who really locks down Honkai and Jingle Yu would have to vertically invest into them for them to be good for the current content. You only need at the very least E1 Robin and possibly even E1 S1 Sunday for them to clear most content in a reasonable amount of time. Some characters aren't suited at all for horizontal investment since they've been heavily power crept, and do require a lot of vertical investment to put in the work. Definitely a predatory tactic, but it still makes them money, doesn't it? So when talking about vertical investment, you want to choose 2 units that can work in both AoE and single target scenarios. Someone like Acheron, Firefly, Big Herda, or Aglaia, they all do well in any scenario, so we'll take those for our example. Then you want to pull for their best supports and possibly even their E1s if you want to go that hard. But going for E1 supports would take a lot of extra gauge and a lot of extra farming. However, if you do end up getting lucky, or after a while end up with the exact teams you want, having an E2 S1 Acheron team with E1 Rabin, Jiaoqiu, and Aventurine, along with an E2 S1 Firefly team with E1 Fugue, Harmony MC, and Linksha, you would probably be able to beat all the content in the game. E2 S1 Acheron not only does a lot of damage, but with the help of E1 Robin is able to ignore resistances even further than she already does, and Firefly can benefit a lot from E1 Linksha and Fugue, as we all know. It's definitely a much riskier playstyle when you vertically invest, but it can reward you with some insanely fast clears, especially if you're vertically invested into someone like Fei Xiao or Aglaia, who have very fast teams too. And if you have E1 Robin, you can use a few characters even in scenarios where they're not favored by the elemental types. If you're a more hardcore player, I would definitely go with vertical investment instead. The biggest example of a hardcore player vertically investing is definitely Kenru Orni, who I'm sure you've seen on YouTube, doing insane clears with Zilla using vertically invested teams. Now, as is the case with Ken Rurouni, vertical investment doesn't even have to be about a certain DPS character, because Ken only has E0S1 Zilla if I remember correctly. A case of vertical investment would be getting E2 Robin, E2 Sunday, E2 Ron Main, E2 Tribi, maybe even more E2 supports than that, and pairing them up with any DPS unit. E0S0 Fei Xiao would be insane with E2 Robin and E1 Topaz, just as E2S1 Fei Xiao would be with a E1 Robin E0 Topaz. It just depends on who you value the most if you're going to vertically invest. This is definitely a pretty smart playstyle that leaves you pretty safe. Just a reminder to not spend any money. Now, I'm a person who has some pretty mixed investment. It's just based on who my favorite characters are and what my Jade funds were looking like at the time and if I got lucky. If I had to choose, I'd give Black Swan, Linksha, and Sparkle all E2s and signature Lycones, but I don't really want to spend money on this game because I don't want to reward them for their behavior, and I don't want to spend time farming during bad updates so I don't reward them with playtime instead. So until they get their shit together, I'll just keep saving my time and my money. And that's it. Thank you so much for watching. Let me know what you thought down in the comments and what your account is looking like these days. Make sure to like and subscribe because a very small percentage of you actually are, as well as join the Expression Discord server for a very fun and lovely community to be a part of. I'll be expecting you there. Thank you again for watching, and I will see you next time.